Hello everyone, I'm James Common, Communications and Engagement Officer at the Natural History Society of Northumbria. But as someone with a keen interest in local nature too, it is rather unusual to find myself on this side of the camera today. But in today's 1829 talk, I wanted to share a little more about a small project that helped me stay sane over 2 years of COVID-19 and the various restrictions it brought. For those who don't know, and I suspect many don't, I live in Newcastle, Heaton to be exact. So as you can imagine, for someone who enjoys watching and recording wildlife, I'm not exactly spoiled for choice when it comes to wild encounters. Sure, we have a few parks in the near vicinity, areas of allotment too, and of course Jesmond Dean. But by and large, my home patch consists of little more than streets, roadsides, gardens, and the odd patch of wasteland. Not overly inspiring, some might say, and until 2020, I would have agreed. Perhaps this is the reason that previously I spent so much time travelling around the Northeast in search of wildlife. An enjoyable hobby, sure, but something that became untenable when COVID-19 hit in 2020. And like many, I was forced to stay local, watching wildlife close to home. Not an entertaining prospect for someone marooned in the city. Like many across the country, restrictions on day-to-day life meant that I needed a new hobby, something to occupy my time. And looking out the window at our little yard with all its concrete wheelie bins and crumbling stone walls, our attention soon turned to gardening and what we could do with our small patch of urban Newcastle. For ourselves, mainly as a sanity check, but also for wildlife and the creatures with whom we share our neighbourhood. And when I say we, I mean my partner Matt. For fear of the repercussions at home, I thought it best to give credit now as he carried out most of the manual labour for this project. But on a more serious note, to say we had started with a blank canvas for our little project would have been an understatement. We had concrete, walls, wheelie bins, as well as absolutely no soil. With the prospect of growing plants absent this an obvious impossibility, we needed containers and lots of them. We needed the soil too. And so throughout early 2020, a mad dash ensued as we bought, borrowed and recycled as many containers as possible, filling them with soil and hoarding plants of all kinds. Some of these were practical, blackcurrant and raspberry that we could eat, but others were known to be beneficial to wildlife. The buddleia, lambsy and lavender, so many of us know. Of course, we also accumulated some plants purely for ornamental value too. But it wasn't long until the dianthus, curry plant and others were evicted in favour of a few new items. Once we'd proven that we could actually keep plants alive here and not kill them, and motivated a little bit by a successful trial run, we soon set our sights a little higher, aiming to integrate more native plant species likely, or so we thought, more appealing to wildlife, and to replace many of the idle ornamentals with others, both colourful and beneficial. Together, we grew a range of species from seed: moth mullein, skullcap, cotton thistle, and fox and cubs. We shipped in teasel, foxgloves, and an ungodly, some might say excessive, amount of scabious. We added marsh marigold and gypsywort to our sorry-looking bucket pond, and bit by bit covered every bit of our garden with green space, even going so far as to trial several more unusual British plants, the henbane you see here being a prime example, and from experience, not something to grow from seed alongside your tomatoes. I know we had that mix-up in 2020. As so many would-be gardeners do, developing somewhat of a hoarder complex, plants were soon shoved tightly together in pots, often in quite queer pairings. Native teasel alongside South American Verbena bonariensis, potted sedum surrounded by bladder campion. A grow bed too, which once hosted lettuces, was soon repurposed and seeded with a native mix. The process was added oxeye daisy, black medic, red campion and other common wildflowers to the fray. And so we come to summer 2021 and an eclectic, colourful and majorly crowded yard. It looks great. I think the gardening efforts were somewhat successful, but more importantly, it certainly beats staring at concrete. And it's utterly full of wildlife, beyond anything we expected when we set out on this process. Ever the lover of spreadsheets and lists, I've tried my best to record each and every critter to visit the yard this year, and reveal that so far over 180 species have been recorded here, including, of course, 40 or so unidentifiables, the aphids, tiny bugs and leaf miners, for which I have neither the patience nor knowledge to contend with. One major lesson from this has been that it really is amazing what can crop up when catered to in a relatively small space. And while we're almost certainly only scratching the surface here, the wildlife that has occupied this once wasted slice of the city has been both rewarding and incredibly interesting to observe. Over the next few slides, we'll take a look at just a few backyard highlights, ones which, given their occurrence here, would no doubt turn up in your gardens should you attempt to tempt them, or lure them, should we say. Befitting this year's focus on bees, it would be rude not to start with them. And I can't be alone in that whenever anyone mentions wildlife gardening, my mind automatically turns to bees. They're conspicuous and readily tempted by flowers. And this year, inspired by NHSM's Northeast Bee Hunt, we've kept a very close eye on the bees visiting our patch, and quite frankly, have been astonished by the diversity of those visiting. Bumblebees, like those pictured here, are perhaps the most obvious, and we're lucky to have 8 species in total this year. Familiar species, mostly, such as the buff-tailed, red-tailed and tree bumblebees shown here, but also by something arguably more interesting, the vestal cuckoo bee, a nest parasite of the buff-tailed bumblebee, and something which, until recently, I'd never observed. Perhaps surprisingly, it was the ornamental flowers which appealed most to the bumblebees. Ornamental scabious, sunflowers and fuchsia, quite frankly trouncing the native plants we'd spent so much time and effort planting for reasons just like this. Well, it's safe to say we expected bumblebees. What we did not anticipate was the huge surge in solitary bees we could observe here too. Some, like the tawny mining bee and red mason bee, were definitely on the agenda, as befitting this urban habitat, but others came as a complete surprise. Buffish mining bee, shown here, the tiny bronze furrow bee, and most exciting of all, a number of blue mason bees, completely new species for me. The one pictured here confused me no end due to the slight dusting of yellow pollen on its head you will see, but thankfully the Northeast is home to a number of knowledgeable enthusiasts who quickly set the record straight. Tracking bees throughout the year has also been interesting too, and later in the season, the early season solitary bees gave way to a Newcastle species, both patchwork and Willoughby's leafcutter bees, both of which showed a clear preference for the leaves of Crocosmia, rather oddly, especially when presented with rose bushes, which the internet suggests should be their favourite. The second species was certainly the most exciting for me and marked the first time I had encountered this fairly common species anywhere. The male shown above is certainly a charmer with its distinctive fluffy feet, and at least I'll know what to look for for the next few years. Finally, on the bee front, I also wanted to share 2 personal highlights. And this year we were lucky enough to have red mason bees breed for the first time in one bee box, while another species, the fork-tailed flower bee, this rather large, cuddly bee you see here to the right, was a delight to observe throughout the summer. Truthfully, I had not anticipated just how loud they are. And you certainly hear their buzzing, you hear them coming before you see them. Whilst talking about bees, it would be rude not to mention other pollinators, and bees alone do not solely fill that niche. And through the process of transforming our yard, it's also been great to notice a substantial increase in butterflies too. We've now recorded all 3 of our common white butterflies here, while a male orange tip was a surprise in early spring, particularly given our lack of garlic mustard and other brassicas. Speckled wood and red admiral have shown up here too, and have become some of our more regular visitors, whilst we've also been graced by peacock, painted lady, and most surprising of all, large skipper, an odd one given the distance between our yard and any nearby grassland. Of the butterflies spotted here, the two pictured here are perhaps the most exciting. Small tortoiseshell, not for its rarity, but because it took us forever to tempt one into visiting. Holly blue, on the other hand, is still quite a rare species locally in the northeast, and as such, it came as quite a shock to spot one sunning itself on the leaf of our buddleia one morning. Another odd occurrence, really, given our lack of holly and ivy, the two food plants of this species' larvae. Sticking with Lepidoptera, and when talking about butterflies, it would be dreadfully remiss not to mention moths too. Indeed, they can be one of the most numerous species groups in any garden, and armed with our small moth trap, we had hoped to record a great many species here. Alas, the new LED streetlights erected by the council directly overhanging our yard put paid to that ambition. But mind you, we have recorded a range of nice moths, a few of which are shown here, including Figure of 80, Angle Shades, the tiny diamondback moth, and the rather gorgeous cinnabar to the right here. Owing to a glut of Oxford ragwort in the near area, these have proven to be one of the most numerous species in our garden, and only a few weeks ago we had discovered they chose to breed here, choosing to lay their eggs on silver ragwort, which seems a rather odd choice of food plant, but I suppose is in the same family. Despite relatively low numbers of moths, there have been a few standout moments too. The beautiful wasp mimic shown here is a currant clearwing, a species with a patchy national distribution which, as its name suggests, is associated with the leaves of blackcurrant, redcurrant and other shrubs. Having a pair of these in residence throughout the summer months was certainly a delight and caused no end of excitement in the garden. The pink moth to the right here is mint moth, and despite no longer owning mint at all, a small population of these seem to have established on our potted oregano. They're energetic and great to see dancing around on sunny days. And finally, for moths at least, two complete surprises. This rather dull-looking moth is an obscure wainscot. Its larvae feed on the leaves of Phragmites, reeds, and as such it is predominantly associated with wetland sites, mainly in the south of England. This moth has only recently started to colonise the northeast, turning up first, I believe, at NHSN's Gosforth Nature Reserve. So to catch one here in the moth trap on a rather average night was a bit of a surprise. Equally, the rather beautiful moth here to the left is Mother Shipton, a rare species associated with grassland, so to see one fluttering above the garden was fairly exciting, and I confess, did result in a prolonged chase with a net. Moths, bees, butterflies are all quite popular winged beasties, but of course they're not the only things to fly around out here. Hoverflies too have been exciting to observe and monitor throughout the summer, if a little harder to identify. So far, we think we have recorded 16 species using the garden, and some have even bred here, including the stripy fella you see here, Helophilus pendulus, the footballer, the striking pied hoverfly to the left with its white comma-shaped markings on the abdomen was also a highlight, while slightly less welcome, at least from a daffodil's point of view, were a number of large Narcissus bulbflies, a fairly chunky, particularly fluffy species which flies throughout the spring and summer. The larvae of most hoverflies are actually a really beneficial thing to have in any garden, with many feeding on pests such as thrips and aphids. A good job too, as for every welcome addition to the garden list, a raft of other species were apparently waiting in the wings to wreak havoc. Back in the days of lettuce growing, slugs would have brought a shiver to my spine, quite frankly. But now, however, they are most welcome, and interesting too. Of the 7 species recorded here, some are to be expected, the larger impressive leopard slug and the smaller brown soil slug. Others were slightly more unusual. The non-native Iberian freeband slug and a great many green cellar slugs, the latter species which feeds on decaying plant matter, and one which provides a reminder that not all slugs are pests and actually help clean up the garden in a certain respect. You'll also notice here a rather large, exquisite, shiny beetle. This is a rosemary beetle, a non-native species originally from North America, which, as its name suggests, feeds on rosemary, lavender, and other similar plants. Despite being lovely to see and definitely one of the most striking creatures spotted in the garden recently. It wasn't long before any lavender in the yard had been completely destroyed. You win some, you lose some, I guess. Of course, where aphids, thrips, and other potentially damaging creatures go, the gardener's friends will soon follow. And this year we've been lucky to record 4 species of ladybird. Some of these, like the 7 and 2 spots shown here, are voracious predators of garden pests such as aphids, as are others such as the 14 spot, which rather oddly have been most numerous species here to date, favouring the mini meadow in the grow bed, in keeping with their status as a known grassland species. Less welcome was the addition of the invasive Harlequin Ladybird on more than one occasion, especially given its tendency to feed on the young of other native ladybird species, including the 2 spots seen previously, which, with many studies linking the spread of this larger species to the decline of the latter. I guess we'll just have to cope with this one, given their widespread status in Newcastle. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. Neither of the wasps shown here are a common wasp, but they are equally welcome. In the top right, you'll spot something that superficially resembles Vespa vogalis, at least to the inexperienced eye, such as my own, and it definitely confused me at first. A few frantic tweets later, however, and this was in fact revealed to be median wasp, a species that only arrived in the UK in the 1980s and is currently expanding its range rapidly northward. The second one shown here remains unidentified, at least at a species level, though the genius of Twitter suggested it was actinimous wasp. What was spectacular about this one was watching it hunt, the wasp waiting patiently on a leaf before launching a lightning-fast pounce onto an unsuspecting hoverfly, almost as large as itself. Only with a bit of background reading did I find out that hoverflies are the main prey for this family. And watching these predator-prey interactions was certainly informative. Who says you need to travel elsewhere to see the drama of nature in action? You may wonder why I've shown wasps on the same slide here. Well, despite widespread opinion, these are actually one of the best species groups to encourage in any garden. The common wasp, Vespa vulgaris, is actually a prolific predator of garden pests, and we've certainly had our fair share here too. Sticking with wasps, and I wanted to quickly share 2 highlights of the summer. The first, and perhaps the most exciting, being the stunning ruby-tailed wasp we see now, found in the greenhouse at the height of summer. Essentially a jewel with wings, these were undoubtedly one species we'd hoped to see when we started recording here, a true beauty. Though one which poses problems for our mason bee nests, this group of wasps known to parasitize the nests of mason bees. The second highlight came only a few weeks back when we discovered this fearsome-looking beast in the garden. Thanks again to the entomologists of Twitter, this was revealed to be Pimpella rufopipes. Forgive me, I cannot pronounce Latin names, but an impressive species which lays its eggs inside the larvae of various moths and butterflies. Certainly this was one of a few species found here that gave me a slight shudder when approaching it for a photo. But really, we have nothing to worry about. Instead, the caterpillars of the large white butterflies currently wreaking havoc on the nasturtiums should be a little more afraid. Equally as beneficial as wasps and ladybirds, but arguably a tad more scary, spiders have also increased tenfold since we set about transforming the yard. Some, like the garden spider shown to the right here, have been particularly numerous. And it is interesting to note this one dealing with a rather large green shield bug. The acrid smell given off by the shield bug in defense was certainly pungent, but did not appear to deter the spider,